There is a category of military emergency that exists outside the planning documents, the kind that does not arrive as a threat track on a radar display or as an intelligence indicator building toward an actionable threshold. It arrives as a single line of text on a communications screen, transmitted in the flat, compressed language of a crew that has run out of options and is using the last seconds of clear communication to pass the only information that matters: position, status, number of souls aboard. After that transmission, there is silence. And silence in the operational environment of Western Iraq on the night of March 12, 2026, did not mean safety. It meant that 6 people were somewhere on the ground in a country where the difference between the controlled territory and the contested territory was measured in kilometers, in a region where Iranian-aligned militia forces had been operating since the war began, and had demonstrated repeatedly that their ability to track and engage American aircraft and personnel was not theoretical. The KC-135 Stratotanker had been operating a refueling track over the Anbar province when the incident occurred. The aircraft's mission was routine in the specific sense that the word applies to operations conducted in an active combat environment. It was the 17th refueling sortie the crew had flown since Operation Epic Fury began, working the same track geometry, the same altitude block, the same radio frequencies, in support of the strike packages that were cycling continuously through the Iraqi airspace corridor toward targets in Iran. The crew knew the track. They knew the aircraft. They knew each other with the particular intimacy of people who have spent 7 of the last 14 days in the same confined space at altitude, managing the physics of aerial refueling in a theater where every tanker orbit is simultaneously a support platform and an intelligence collection opportunity for the adversary below. At 11:41 p.m. on March 12th, the aircraft's transponder signal disappeared from the Airspace Control Center's display. It did not fade. It did not degrade. It stopped. The instantaneous absence of a signal that had been continuous for 4 hours and 22 minutes, replaced by the silence that air traffic controllers learned to read as a category of event rather than a technical anomaly. The controller, on watch, transmitted immediately on guard frequency, the emergency channel monitored by all military aircraft in the theater. No response. She transmitted again. No response. She flagged the watch supervisor at 11:47 p.m. and began the emergency notification sequence that, within 40 seconds, had reached the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and was being assessed by the duty watch team with the particular focus of people who understand that the difference between a communication failure and a crew in distress is a distinction that cannot be resolved from a desk. The last known position of the aircraft was a point in the Al-Anbar Desert, approximately 61 kilometers southwest of the city of Ramadi, terrain that was nominally within the Iraqi government's administrative control and practically within a zone of contested influence where the Islamic resistance in Iraq, an umbrella organization of Iranian-backed militia groups that had been conducting operations against American assets since the first day of the conflict, had been assessed as maintaining a significant presence. The same militia network that had claimed responsibility for multiple drone strikes against American positions in the preceding 2 weeks. The same network that had announced, in a statement distributed through its media channels on March 10th, that any American aircraft that could be reached would be reached. The combat, search, and rescue alert crew at Al-Assad Air Base had been at 15-minute readiness since the beginning of the conflict. They had been recalled to 5-minute readiness at 11:43 p.m., 90 seconds after the transponder loss was flagged, by a watch officer who had assessed the situation with the economy of judgment that 15 years of combat aviation experience produces, and had made the call before the formal tasking arrived, because the formal tasking was going to say the same thing his assessment had already concluded. He did not wait for the tasking. He made the call, and then waited 30 seconds for the tasking to confirm what he had already set in motion, the HH-60W Jolly Green. 2 helicopters were airborne at 11:51 p.m. 2 aircraft, 4 crew each, pilots, flight engineers, and pararescue men whose specific function in this operation was to reach the 6 people on the ground and bring them back regardless of what the ground between them and the aircraft contained. The pararescue men had been briefed on the threat environment of the Anbar corridor in the preceding 24 hours. The briefing had been updated that morning with new intelligence indicating increased militia ground activity in the zone southwest of Ramadi. The update had not changed the crew's readiness posture. It had changed the specific parameters of their equipment load. Additional trauma supplies, a second communications package, the particular items that experienced pararescue men add to their kit when the intelligence suggests that the time between reaching the survivors and getting them airborne may not be short. The A-10 Sea Thunderbolt. 2 flight that was assigned as escort had been on alert at the same base. They were airborne at 11:53 p.m. The 2-minute separation between the rescue helicopters and their escort was not ideal. It was the product of the specific sequence in which aircraft can be made ready at a forward base operating under continuous threat posture. A sequence that is practiced and rehearsed and that still produces a 2-minute gap, because the physics of aircraft preparation do not compress beyond a certain threshold, regardless of the urgency applied to them. The A-10 pilots were aware of the gap. They were closing it at maximum continuous power on the transit heading. At 12:04 a.m. on March 13th, an overhead ISR platform, an MQ-9 Reaper that had been reassigned from its original tasking within minutes of the transponder loss, located a debris field on the desert floor 6 nautical miles south of the last transponder position. The debris pattern was consistent with a controlled impact event rather than a catastrophic in-flight breakup. The wreckage was distributed across approximately 400 meters in a linear pattern that indicated the aircraft had been intact and under some degree of directional control when it contacted the terrain. This was the first piece of operationally significant information since the transponder loss. The aircraft had not disintegrated at altitude. The crew had brought it down. The second piece of information arrived at 12:06 a.m. The MQ-9's electro-optical sensor, stabilized on the debris field, detected movement. Not one signature. Multiple. At the northern edge of the debris field, separated from the main wreckage by approximately 80 meters, 3 thermal signatures were moving. Slowly, grouped together, in a pattern consistent with ambulatory personnel supporting a 4th individual who was not moving independently. The MQ-9 operator counted the signatures twice. 4 confirmed. 2 more at the southern edge of the debris field, stationary, in a configuration that could not be assessed as ambulatory from the sensor resolution available at the MQ-9's altitude. 6 total. All present. The rescue helicopter-led pilot received the position update at 12:07 a.m. and adjusted his heading. Range to target, 19 nautical miles. Transit time at current speed, 11 minutes. The A-10 escort was 8 nautical miles behind him. He transmitted the gap to his wingman and received the acknowledgement, and then focused on the 11 minutes between his current position and the debris field, which was the only interval that mattered. At 12:09 a.m., the MQ-9 operator transmitted a contact report that changed the calculation. 3 vehicle signatures had appeared on the edge of the sensor frame, moving on a track from the northeast, on a heading that projected toward the debris field. The vehicles were traveling without headlights. The MQ-9's synthetic aperture radar assessed their speed at approximately 40 kilometers per hour across terrain that did not have a road in the relevant location. The absence of headlights on terrain with no road, moving at night toward an aircraft crash site at speed. The assessment did not require formal analysis. The watch officer at the CAOC transmitted the contact report to the rescue package and simultaneously tasked the MQ-9 to maintain track on both the survivors and the vehicles and to transmit a time-to-convergence estimate. The estimate came back at 12:10 a.m. At current rates of movement, the vehicles would reach the debris field approximately 4 minutes before the rescue helicopters. The lead pilot transmitted to the A-10 escort. The A-10s acknowledged and pushed their throttles forward. The gap between the rescue package and its escort was now 6 nautical miles. The A-10s could not close 6 nautical miles in 4 minutes at any speed the airframe's engines permitted. The lead pilot made his decision at 12:10:31 a.m. He transmitted it to his wingman in 8 words: push speed, arrive together, hold short if not. Then he pushed his own throttle and began the calculation that defines the specific anxiety of combat search and rescue. The race between the people who need to be reached and the people who want to reach them first. Measured in nautical miles and minutes, and the particular clarity of purpose that makes the arithmetic simple, even when the outcome is not. At 12:13 a.m., the MQ-9 operator transmitted a weapons release request against the lead vehicle. The one that had pulled ahead of the other 2 and was now 600 meters from the debris field's northern edge, where the 4 ambulatory survivors were located. The request went to the CAOC watch officer, who had authority to approve within 30 seconds or elevate to the duty general. He approved at 12:14 a.m. The MQ-9 released an AGM-114 Hellfire at 12:13:22 a.m. The lead vehicle was rendered inoperable at 12:13:31 a.m., 400 meters from the northern edge of the debris field. The remaining 2 vehicles stopped. They did not turn away. They stopped, which the MQ-9 operator assessed, correctly, as the behavior of personnel who have dismounted and are continuing on foot, rather than the behavior of personnel who have broken contact. She transmitted the assessment at 12:13:45 a.m. The watch officer elevated to the duty general at 12:13:48 a.m. and received authorization for a second engagement at 12:14:01 a.m. The MQ-9 released its second Hellfire at 12:14 and 9 seconds a.m. The second vehicle was rendered inoperable. The third vehicle turned and drove northeast at maximum speed. Dismounted personnel from the first 2 vehicles were now somewhere in the desert between their stopped position and the debris field. The MQ-9's sensor could not resolve individual personnel signatures at the resolution needed to distinguish them from the survivors. The thermal environment of the desert at night, the radiating heat of the sand, the residual warmth of the destroyed vehicles, the body temperatures of everyone within the sensor's frame, had become complex enough that the operator was working at the edge of what the system could confirm, rather than the center of what it could see clearly. The rescue helicopters reached the debris field at 12:14:37 a.m. The lead aircraft put down 60 meters north of the survivor cluster, in a flat area that the pilot had identified from the MQ-9 feed as clear of major debris. The rotor wash from the landing threw desert grit across a radius that the pararescue men, exiting the aircraft in the practice sequence of people who have trained this movement until it requires no deliberate thought, felt against their kit and their exposed skin as a physical clock. The helicopter was on the ground. The rotors were turning. The time available before the aircraft became a target that something with a rocket-propelled grenade could engage at close range was finite and known and not long. The 4 survivors were reached at 12:15 and 2 seconds a.m. The pararescue man who reached them first assessed the situation in the compressed, sequential manner of his training. 1 critical, chest trauma, labored breathing, conscious, eyes tracking, 2 ambulatory with injuries consistent with the impact sequence, 1 ambulatory without visible injury but presenting in the specific kind of shock that does not announce itself as shock because the body is still running on the biochemistry of survival and has not yet finished processing what has just occurred. The pararescue man had seen this presentation before. He knew what it looked like 2 hours from now, when the biochemistry ran out and the full physical account came due, and he factored it into his triage sequence without breaking stride. He transmitted the assessment to the lead aircraft at 12:15 and 9 seconds a.m. and began moving the critical casualty. The critical casualty was a man who had been conscious long enough since the impact to understand that the rotor sound he could hear was the specific sound of rescue, and who was tracking the pararescue men above him with eyes that conveyed the particular combination of trust and fear that exists in the space between a life-threatening injury and the arrival of someone with the training to address it. The pararescueman worked with his hands and his kit, and the knowledge that the time available before the aircraft needed to lift was a fixed quantity, and that fixed quantity was already running. The 2 stationary signatures at the southern edge of the debris field were reached by the 2nd Rescue Helicopter's pararescue man at 12:15:44 a.m. Both were alive. 1 was unconscious with head trauma. 1 was conscious and had already begun moving toward the sound of the rotors before the pararescue man reached him. Moving on instinct, on the sound of American engines in the dark, toward the noise that meant the wait was over. At 12:17 a.m., the MQ-9 operator reported thermal signatures consistent with dismounted personnel at 230 meters north of the lead rescue helicopter's position, moving south. The A-10s arrived at 12:17:31 a.m. The lead A-10 pilot had the debris field and both rescue helicopters on his targeting display and the MQ-9's contact azimuth in his ear, and the specific knowledge that the helicopters on the ground had been stationary for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and that 2 minutes and 40 seconds was already longer than the planning parameters had allowed for. He rolled in on the contact bearing at 12:17:42 a.m. and the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the weapon that the A-10 was built around, the reason the aircraft exists in the inventory, the sound that anyone who has heard it in the dark over a landing zone carries with them, ran for 1.4 seconds and covered the contact bearing from 250 meters to the limit of the sensor-confirmed signature. The movement stopped. The lead rescue helicopter lifted at 12:18:04 a.m., with 4 survivors aboard. The critical casualty stabilized by the pararescue man who was managing the chest trauma with the focused, unhurried competence of someone working a problem whose parameters are known and whose solution is a function of technique and time and the supplies in the kit on his back. The 2nd helicopter lifted at 12:18:19 a.m. with 2 survivors. The A-10s held over the debris field until both helicopters had cleared the threat radius. Then they climbed and turned west, back toward Al-Assad, back toward the alert posture and the next tasking in the flat, functional debrief in which the events of the preceding 37 minutes would be described in the language of operations, rather than the language of what it actually is to spend 37 minutes doing what they had just done. The critical casualty was in surgery at Al-Assad's medical facility at 1:09 a.m. The surgical team had been notified during the transit and was ready. The procedure lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. The patient was assessed as stable at 3:23 a.m. All 6 crew members of the KC-135 were alive. The formal investigation into the aircraft's loss was opened at 6 a.m. on March 13th. The Islamic resistance in Iraq had posted a claim of responsibility at 12:31 a.m., a claim that CENTCOM assessed as unverified, and that the investigation's early findings, based on the debris field pattern and the crew's initial statements, did not confirm. The investigation remained open. The cause of the aircraft's loss, whether the crew had managed a mechanical failure to a survivable outcome, or had been struck by something that the radar picture had not captured, or had encountered a combination of factors that the debris field could not yet fully resolve, was a question that would take weeks to answer with the precision that the loss of an aircraft and its crew demands. What was not a question by 6 a.m. on March 13th was whether the crew was alive. They were, all 6, because 2 HH-60W pilots had pushed their throttles forward when the calculations said they would arrive 4 minutes behind the threat, and a pararescue man had moved a critical casualty from open desert to a helicopter in 58 seconds, and 2 A-10 pilots had arrived 31 seconds before the window closed and had used the weapon their aircraft was built around in the dark over a landing zone where the people it needed to protect were counting every second that the rotors remained on the ground. 37 minutes from transponder loss to wheels up with all survivors aboard. This is the number that the after-action review will file under mission success. It is also the number that contains, within it, the 4 minutes that the rescue package spent racing the vehicles across the desert, and the 31 seconds between the A-10's arrival and the moment the movement toward the landing zone stopped, and the 58 seconds between a pararescue man reaching a critically injured survivor and the aircraft lifting, and all the other intervals that are invisible inside the summary figure but that the people who lived through them know precisely, because those are the intervals that determined whether the summary figure was the one it was or the one it might have been. The KC-135 that went down in the Anbar desert on March 12th is wreckage in the sand. The 6 people who were aboard it are not. The desert keeps what falls into it. The men who flew into it that night brought back what did not belong there.